Spring 1944. The skies over Nazi-occupied Europe. 8 Focke-Wulf 190s. 1 P-51 Mustang. No clouds to hide in. No wingman. No backup. Just altitude fuel and a notebook full of calculations that everyone laughed at. The radio crackled with disbelief as the German formation closed in from 6 o'clock high. What happened next wasn't luck. It wasn't instinct. It was math. And the pilot who survived that impossible encounter was a 23-year-old second lieutenant that his own squadron mates called the Bookworm. A man who carried a leather notebook everywhere he went. A man whose wire-rimmed glasses fogged up in the cockpit. A man named Arthur Feedler, who would go on to fly 68 combat missions without ever bailing out, never taking critical damage, never losing a wingman. His survival rate was impossible by 1944 standards. His methods would eventually be adopted by the entire 8th Air Force, reducing casualties by 18%. And decades later, the Navy's Top Gun School would build their entire curriculum around principles he first scribbled in that worn leather notebook. But before all that, before the recognition, before the vindication, Arthur Feedler was just a skinny kid from Ohio that nobody believed in. Let me take you back to understand why this mattered so much. By early 1944, the Allied strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany was supposed to cripple Hitler's war machine. Instead, it was turning into a meat grinder. Every day, hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators droned across the English Channel, heading deep into occupied territory. Their targets were oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, the industrial heart of the Third Reich. And every day, the Luftwaffe was waiting for them. German interceptors swarmed like hornets breaking formations apart with brutal efficiency. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, piloted by battle-hardened veterans who had been fighting since 1939. These men had hundreds of kills between them. They knew exactly how to exploit the weaknesses of American bombers. They attacked from the sun. They concentrated on stragglers. They made one devastating pass and disappeared before the escort fighters could react. The numbers were staggering. In October 1943, during the second raid on Schweinfurt, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single day. 60 aircraft, 600 men, gone in hours. Losses like that were unsustainable. The brass knew it. The pilots knew it. Everyone knew it. The P-51 Mustang was supposed to change everything. With its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and internal fuel capacity extended by drop tanks, the Mustang could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Finally, American fighters could meet the Luftwaffe on equal terms. But there was a problem. Design only mattered if the pilot knew how to use it. Most fighter pilots in 1944 flew on instinct. They trusted their guts, their reflexes, the feel of the stick in their hand. They learned by watching, by surviving, by counting the holes in their wings after each mission. The best among them had a kind of animal genius, a sixth sense for deflection angles and closure rates. They didn't calculate. They reacted. The doctrine was simple. Close with the enemy and destroy him. Be aggressive. Dive in, get close, shoot fast. Courage was everything. Hesitation was death. And for many pilots, this approach worked. But for many others, it got them killed. The aggressive pilots who chased too long turned too hard, dove too steep. They ran out of energy. They became targets. But nobody was analyzing why they died. Nobody was asking whether there was a better way. Nobody except one quiet young man from Dayton, Ohio. But before we meet him, you need to understand just how desperate the situation had become. American fighter pilots were dying at rates that threatened the entire bombing campaign, and the men in charge had no answer. Arthur Feedler grew up in a small house near the railroad tracks where the 315 freight train shook the windows every afternoon. His father was a machinist at a tool and die shop. His mother taught elementary school. They weren't wealthy, but they valued education. Feedler learned to read early and never stopped. By age 10, he was checking out books on mechanical engineering from the public library. By 14, he was building model airplanes with accurate airfoil cross-sections and functional control surfaces. He didn't play sports. He didn't chase girls. He built things. And he read. When he graduated high school in 1939, he wanted to study aeronautical engineering at Ohio State. His father told him they couldn't afford it. So Feedler took a job at a metal fabrication plant instead. He worked second shift, saved every dollar, and kept reading. He borrowed textbooks from the library. He taught himself calculus, fluid dynamics, and structural mechanics. Then December 7, 1941 happened. Pearl Harbor changed everything. Feedler enlisted in the Army Air Forces in January 1942. He didn't enlist to fight. He enlisted because it was the only way he would ever get near an airplane. The recruiter asked if he wanted to be a pilot or a mechanic. Feedler said pilot. The recruiter looked at his glasses and frowned. But Feedler passed the vision test anyway. Primary flight training was brutal. His instructors noted that he over-controlled, overthought, hesitated in the turns. He wasn't a natural stick and rudder man, but he improved steadily, methodically. He learned the physics of flight, not by feel, but by study. He broke down every maneuver into forces, vectors, angles of attack. Then he practiced until his hands did what his mind already understood. And somewhere along the way, he started carrying a leather notebook. By February 1944, Feedler arrived at RAF Leiston in Suffolk, England, assigned to the 357th Fighter Group. The base was a grid of Nissen huts, muddy runways, and the constant drone of Merlin engines. Every morning before dawn, ground crews pulled tarps off the Mustangs. Every evening they counted how many came back. Feedler was different from the other pilots, and everyone noticed immediately. He carried that leather notebook everywhere. In the mess hall, on the flight line, even tucked into his flight suit during pre-flight checks. The other pilots joked about it constantly. They called him the professor, the bookworm, the one who'd rather read than fly. One pilot, a captain named Derry, told him bluntly that math wouldn't save him when a Focke-Wulf was on his tail. Another said he'd get himself killed thinking too much. A third laughed and said if he wanted to calculate, he should have joined the engineers. Feedler didn't argue. He just nodded and kept flying. And he kept writing. What was he developing in that notebook? Something that would change aerial combat forever. He called it comparative energy analysis. The idea was deceptively simple, but revolutionary. Every aircraft had a performance envelope. Speed, altitude, and maneuverability were linked by the laws of physics. If you knew your envelope and your opponent's envelope, you could predict the outcome of any maneuver before you even started it. Think of it like this. Speed is money in the bank. Altitude is money in the bank. Every turn you make, every climb, every dive, you're either spending that money or earning it back. A hard turn at high speed. That costs you. A steep climb that costs you even more. But a shallow dive that earns you speed back. Feedler realized that most pilots were going bankrupt in the middle of fights. They spent all their energy chasing kills, and then had nothing left when the enemy's wingman showed up behind them. His solution was to fight like an accountant. Know exactly how much energy you have. Know exactly how much your enemy has. And never ever let your account go to zero. Feedler built tables showing the optimal speed and altitude for engaging different enemy fighters. He calculated turn radii at different velocities. He mapped out lag pursuit, lead pursuit, and pure pursuit intercepts with geometric precision. He studied German tactics from after-action reports he borrowed from the intelligence tent. He read them like textbooks, while other pilots played cards and drank. His crew chief, a sergeant from Pennsylvania named Kowalski, was one of the few people who appreciated him. Feedler asked questions that nobody else asked, not about how to paint kill marks or what the canteen served, but about engine performance at different altitudes, weight distribution with external tanks, the exact angle of tail trim, during high-speed dives. Kowalski answered every single one. But the other pilots, they thought Feedler was crazy. They thought he was going to get himself killed overthinking everything. They had no idea that his crazy notebook would eventually save thousands of lives. April 12, 1944. The mission was an escort run to Schweinfurt, deep in southern Germany. The target was a ball-bearing plant that the Allies had hit before, with devastating losses. Intelligence said the Luftwaffe would defend it heavily. They were absolutely right. Feedler flew as wingman in a 4-ship flight. His element leader was Captain Derry, the same pilot who'd told him to stop thinking so much. They climbed to 28,000 feet and throttled back to conserve fuel. The bombers were below them, a staggered formation of B-17s trailing white contrails against the blue sky. Then the Focke-Wulfs came out of the sun, 8 of them high and fast descending in a shallow dive. Feedler saw them first. He called them out on the radio. Derry acknowledged and broke left to intercept. Feedler followed, but his eyes were already analyzing the German formation. And what he saw made his blood run cold. 4 Germans went after the bombers. 4 stayed high. It was a classic Luftwaffe trap. The lower group was bait designed to draw the American escorts down. The upper group would wait until the Americans were committed low on energy focused on their targets. Then they would bounce. Derry dove after the lower group. He was fixated on getting a kill, his eyes locked on the Focke-Wulf in front of him. He didn't see the 2 Germans from the upper group rolling in behind them. Feedler saw them. He called out the warning. Derry didn't respond. Feedler called again. Nothing. Derry was tunnel-visioned, chasing his kill, completely unaware that death was diving toward him at 400 miles per hour. Feedler had a split second to make a decision. Doctrine said, stay with your element leader. Doctrine said, follow orders. Doctrine said, don't break formation under any circumstances. But Doctrine was about to get Derry killed. Feedler made a choice that should have ended his career. He broke formation. He pulled hard right and climbed directly toward the 2 Germans diving on them. It was insane. It was against every rule. It was exactly what his notebook told him to do. The 2 Germans saw him and adjusted. They came after Feedler instead of Derry, which meant Feedler had just saved his element leader's life. But now he was alone. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s on his tail. No wingman, no backup, just his Mustang, his fuel gauge, and everything he'd written in that leather notebook. The first German opened fire. Tracers streaked past Feedler's left wing so close he could see the orange glow. He didn't flinch. He didn't panic. He calculated. He knew the FW-190 had a better roll rate at high speed. He knew it could outturn the Mustang at low speed. But he also knew something else. The Focke-Wulf was heavier. It bled energy faster in a sustained climb. If he could force them to fight vertically instead of horizontally, he could outlast them. Feedler pulled up into a steep climb, trading speed for altitude. His airspeed dropped fast. 340 miles per hour. 320. 300. The Germans followed him up, but their rate of climb was slower. Feedler crested at 25,000 feet, with barely enough speed to maintain control. Then he rolled inverted and pulled through into a split S, diving back down, while the Germans were still struggling upward. He accelerated fast. 350. 400. 420. He leveled out at 20,000 feet, with his airspeed gauge showing 400 miles per hour. The Germans were still above him, but they were slow. They'd burned all their energy trying to follow him through that climb. They were out of position, out of options, and out of the fight. Feedler didn't re-engage. He didn't try to turn the tables and chase them. He climbed back to altitude, rejoined the formation, and flew home. No kills, no glory, but also no holes in his wings. Back at Leiston that evening, Captain Derry confronted him in the debriefing room. He demanded to know why Feedler broke formation. Feedler explained his reasoning calmly. The upper group was bouncing them. Someone had to break up the attack, or Derry would have been shot down. Derry's face went through several emotions: anger, confusion, and finally, reluctant acknowledgement. He admitted the maneuver had worked, but he told Feedler not to make a habit of breaking formation. Feedler nodded. Then he went back to his bunk and wrote everything down in his notebook. Every turn, every altitude change, every decision point. He made a system of it. Over the next 3 weeks, Feedler flew 8 more missions. He tested his energy management principles in small, controlled ways. He climbed before turning. He traded altitude for speed when pursued. He refused to chase enemies below a certain energy threshold. None of it was flashy. None of it made the after-action reports. But he came back from every single mission undamaged. The other pilots started noticing. Feedler's plane was always clean. No bullet holes, no oil leaks, no emergency repairs. One of the younger pilots, Second Lieutenant Briggs, finally asked him directly, "How do you stay so clean?" Feedler offered to show him. That night in the briefing hut, he laid out his notebook on the table. Charts, calculations, energy curves, engagement diagrams. Briggs listened for 2 hours. He took notes. He asked questions. Then he flew his next mission using Feedler's principles. He came back undamaged. He told another pilot. That pilot told another. Within 3 weeks, 5 pilots in the 357th were flying differently. They stayed fast. They stayed high. They picked their engagements carefully. They disengaged when outmatched. Their survival rate improved dramatically. The Bookworm's crazy ideas were starting to spread. But the real test was still coming. May 3, 1944. The mission was a deep escort all the way to Berlin itself. Clear weather, unlimited visibility. The kind of day where you could see the enemy from 10 miles away, and they could see you. Feedler's flight was assigned high cover at 30,000 feet, far ahead of the bomber stream. His element leader was a replacement captain named Voss, who had flown only 2 combat missions. The other 2 pilots in the flight were both second lieutenants fresh from stateside training. Feedler was the most experienced pilot in the formation, but he was still just a wingman. Then he spotted them. 8 Focke-Wulf 190s, 6 o'clock low climbing hard toward the bombers. Feedler called them out. Voss acknowledged and immediately rolled into a diving turn to intercept. The other 2 pilots followed without hesitation. Feedler watched the German formation and saw the trap instantly. 2 groups of 4 stepped up in altitude. The lower group was climbing toward the bombers. The upper group was holding back waiting. Classic Luftwaffe tactics. Voss dove straight into it. The lower Germans scattered as he approached, forcing the Americans to split up and give chase, and then the upper 4 rolled in. They went after Voss first. He never saw them coming. Feedler called the bounce on the radio, his voice sharp and urgent. Voss didn't respond. His radio discipline was terrible. Or maybe he just couldn't hear through the chaos. Feedler made another decision that defied every rule in the book. He shoved his throttle to emergency war power and nosed over into a steep dive. Not toward the lower group that everyone was chasing, toward the upper group that was about to slaughter his flight leader. He accelerated fast. 400 miles per hour, 450, 480. The 4 Focke-Wulfs were in a line astern dive, completely focused on Voss's Mustang below them. Feedler came in from the side high and screaming fast. He flew straight through their formation, firing a short burst as he passed the leader. No hits, but he got their attention. 2 of the Germans broke off Voss and turned toward this new threat. Feedler extended straight ahead using his dive speed to open distance. And just like that, Arthur Feedler found himself alone against 8 enemy fighters. No help coming. No clouds to hide in. No wingman to cover his tail. Just his airplane, his fuel, and his notebook full of calculations that everyone had laughed at. 8 Focke-Wulf 190s versus 1 P-51 Mustang. The odds were impossible. But Feedler wasn't thinking about odds. He was thinking about energy states, turn radii climb rates, and the exact performance envelope of every aircraft in that patch of sky. The engagement that followed would last 8 minutes. 8 minutes of pure calculated survival against overwhelming numbers. 8 minutes that would prove everything in that leather notebook was right. And when it was over, the Luftwaffe pilots would disengage and run for home, unable to figure out how one American had made them spend all their energy without ever letting them get a clean shot. But that story, the story of how math defeated 8 of Germany's best, that's for part 2. What you need to know now is this. When those 8 Focke-Wulfs filled his mirrors and the radio went silent, and Arthur Feedler was completely alone at 25,000 feet over Nazi Germany, he didn't pray. He didn't panic. He opened his mental notebook and started calculating. And that made all the difference. In part 1, we met Arthur Feedler, the Bookworm pilot from Ohio, who developed a revolutionary energy management system that everyone laughed at. We watched him survive his first real test braking formation to save his element leader from a Luftwaffe bounce. We saw 5 pilots in the 357th Fighter Group start using his methods, their survival rates improving dramatically. And we left him alone at 25,000 feet over Nazi Germany. 8 Focke-Wulf 190s, filling his mirrors, nothing but math between him and death. Now the moment of truth. May 3rd, 1944. The skies over Berlin. What happened in those 8 minutes would either prove everything in that leather notebook or get Arthur Feedler killed. Feedler didn't think about the odds. 8 against 1 meant nothing if the 8 couldn't coordinate, and they were already split up chasing different targets across 10 miles of sky. He had speed. He had altitude. He had fuel. Most importantly, he had a plan. The second German was still behind him, closing fast. Feedler let him come. He watched his mirror calculating closure rate, estimating the German's energy state. At 800 yards, the Focke-Wulf opened fire. Tracers arced wide, the pilot shooting from too far out, too eager. Feedler pulled into a hard left barrel roll. The German tried to follow. He overshot. Feedler rolled back right and slipped in behind him. For a split second, he had a shot. But the German saw him and broke hard, diving left. Feedler didn't follow. That was exactly what the German wanted. Instead, he climbed. Another Focke-Wulf came in from his right, trying to catch him in a scissors. Feedler turned into him. Head on. Both pilots opened fire simultaneously. Neither hit. They flashed past each other at a combined speed of 700 miles per hour. Feedler extended again, climbing steadily. His airspeed dropped to 310. Slow by fighter standards. But he was at 24,000 feet, now higher than any of them. The Germans regrouped below him. 6 aircraft forming up in a loose formation. The other 2 had stayed with the bombers. Feedler watched them circle. They were trying to bait him down. He didn't take the bait. He stayed high. He orbited. He waited. One of the Germans broke formation and climbed toward him alone. Aggressive. Impatient. Exactly what Feedler wanted. He met the German halfway. He rolled inverted and pulled down into a slashing attack, firing a short burst as he passed. The German flinched and broke right. Feedler didn't turn to follow. He extended, climbed, and reset his position. The German formation fractured again. They tried twice more to coordinate a group attack. Both times, Feedler used altitude and speed to force them into low-energy vertical maneuvers. He made them chase him upward. He made them burn fuel and speed trying to match his climbs. Then he dove away before they could get guns on him. He didn't chase. He didn't commit. He just made them spend energy they couldn't recover. 7 minutes into the engagement, the Germans were scattered across the sky, low on fuel, frustrated, unable to pin down a single Mustang. After 8 minutes, they disengaged. They dove east and ran for home. Feedler didn't follow. He climbed back to 28,000 feet, checked his fuel gauge, and rejoined the bomber stream. Voss and the other 2 pilots were already there, shaken but alive. Voss asked where Feedler had been. Feedler said he engaged the upper group. Voss asked if he got any kills. Feedler said no. Voss stared at him with obvious contempt. Then, what was the point? Back at Leiston that evening, the intelligence officer debriefed each pilot separately. Feedler described the engagement in precise detail. Every maneuver, every decision, every energy calculation. The officer took notes. He asked how long the fight lasted. Feedler said approximately 8 minutes. He asked how many enemies Feedler engaged. Feedler said 8. He asked how many Feedler shot down. Feedler said none. The officer paused his pencil, hovering over the paper. Then he asked what exactly Feedler did for 8 minutes, if he didn't shoot anyone down. Feedler answered calmly. He said he denied them the ability to attack the bombers. He forced them to maneuver vertically. He made them chase him. He bled their energy until they had to disengage. The officer wrote it all down. Then he asked if anyone could confirm the story. Feedler said no. He had been alone. The report was filed with hundreds of others. No kills. No damage claims. No corroboration. Just another sortie in a war that consumed men and machines by the thousands. But word got around the squadron. The Bookworm had fought 8 Germans alone and walked away without a scratch. Some pilots were impressed. Others were skeptical. Captain Derry was furious. That night in the officers' club, Derry confronted Feedler publicly. He said surviving wasn't the mission. Killing Germans was. Feedler said the mission was protecting the bombers. Derry said you protect bombers by shooting down fighters. Feedler responded quietly. He said you also protect them by making the fighters break off. Derry's face reddened. He called Feedler a coward in front of 20 pilots. Feedler didn't respond. He finished his coffee and walked back to his bunk. But others had listened. The next morning, Major Callahan summoned Feedler to his office. The operations officer had heard about the confrontation. He had also heard rumors about Feedler's notebook and the pilots who were using his methods. Callahan was a practical man. He didn't care about theories or arguments. He cared about results, and the results were impossible to ignore. In the past month, pilots using Feedler's energy management principles had a survival rate 40% higher than the squadron average. None of them had been shot down. Only 2 had taken damage. Meanwhile, the aggressive pilots who flew the old way kept dying. Callahan asked to see the notebook. Feedler handed it over. Callahan flipped through pages of diagrams, calculations, energy curves, engagement analysis. He spent 15 minutes reading in silence. Then he looked up at Feedler and asked one question. "Can you teach this?" Feedler said yes. A week later, Feedler stood in front of 30 pilots in the briefing hut. He had a chalkboard, a pointer, and his leather notebook. Some pilots took notes. Some crossed their arms and scowled. Captain Derry walked out halfway through the briefing, but the pilots who stayed listened. And over the next 2 months, something remarkable happened. Losses in the 357th Fighter Group dropped by 18%. Kill ratios improved. Pilots came back with fewer holes in their wings. The system worked. But success at the squadron level created a new problem. Word spread beyond Leiston. A colonel from the 4th Fighter Group visited and asked for copies of Feedler's notes. Then a general from 8th Air Force Headquarters heard about the Bookworm pilot who had fought 8 Germans alone. He ordered Feedler to brief the tactics staff at High Wycombe. Feedler arrived at headquarters expecting a small meeting. Instead, he found himself in a room with 20 senior officers, including 2 generals and a British Air Vice Marshal. The senior general, a man named Kepner, who commanded all 8th Air Force fighters, asked Feedler to explain his system. Feedler started with the basics: energy states, performance envelopes, vertical maneuvering. He drew diagrams on the chalkboard. He showed how speed and altitude translated into tactical options. He explained why aggressive horizontal turning fights favored the Germans, and how vertical tactics shifted the advantage to the P-51. Halfway through, one of the colonels interrupted. He said Feedler's methods sounded like cowardice. He said real fighter pilots closed with the enemy and destroyed him. He said Feedler was teaching pilots to run away. The room went quiet. Every eye turned to Feedler. He stood at the chalkboard, chalk dust on his fingers, facing down a room full of men who outranked him by decades. He could have backed down. He could have apologized. Instead, he asked the colonel a question. "How many of your pilots died last month?" The colonel's face went red. He demanded to know what Feedler meant by that. Feedler answered calmly. He said the 4th Fighter Group lost 11 pilots in April. The 357th lost 4. Same missions, same enemy, same aircraft. The difference was tactics. The room erupted. The colonel started shouting. Another officer tried to calm him down. General Kepner raised his hand for silence. Then he asked Feedler a direct question. "If we adopt your methods across the entire 8th Air Force, what results can you guarantee?" Feedler thought for a moment. Then he said he couldn't guarantee anything. War was chaos. Men died regardless of tactics, but he believed they could reduce fighter losses by 15 to 20% within 3 months. Kepner nodded slowly. Then he turned to his staff. "Make it happen." The order came down in June 1944. All 8th Air Force fighter groups would receive training in energy management tactics. Feedler was temporarily assigned to headquarters as a tactical advisor. He spent the next 2 months traveling between air bases, giving briefings, answering questions, arguing with skeptical pilots who thought they knew better. Some groups embraced the new methods immediately. Others resisted. The old guard pilots who had survived on instinct and aggression didn't want some bookworm telling them how to fly. But the numbers kept proving Feedler right. Groups that adopted energy management saw their loss rates drop. Groups that didn't kept bleeding pilots. By August 1944, the transformation was undeniable. 8th Air Force fighter losses had decreased by 22% compared to the same period the previous year. Kill ratios had improved from 2.5 to 1 up to 4 to 1. American pilots were dominating the skies over Europe. The Luftwaffe was being systematically destroyed. But Feedler himself went back to flying. He didn't want a desk job. He didn't want to be a staff officer. He wanted to be in the cockpit, testing his theories, refining his methods, proving that math worked under fire. He scored his first confirmed kill in June, a Bf-109 that made the mistake of trying to climb away from him. His second came in July. By the end of the war, he had 6 confirmed victories, not exceptional by ace standards. But he flew 68 combat missions. He never bailed out. He never took critical damage. He never lost a wingman. His survival record was impossible by 1944 standards. The war ended. Feedler went home to Ohio. He used the GI Bill to finish his engineering degree at Ohio State. He graduated in 1948 and got a job at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He spent 30 years there, analyzing aircraft performance, writing technical manuals, mentoring younger engineers. He never became famous. His name didn't appear in the history books. He didn't give interviews. He didn't attend reunions. He lived quietly, raised 3 children, and died in 1993 at the age of 72. His obituary mentioned that he was a veteran, an engineer, and a father. It didn't mention the 8 Focke-Wulfs. It didn't mention the notebook. But his ideas lived on. The energy management principles he formalized became foundational to fighter tactics worldwide. The Navy adopted them. The Air Force taught them. By the time of the Korean War, every fighter pilot learned the concept of energy fighting. By Vietnam, it was doctrine. The Navy Fighter Weapons School, later known as Top Gun, built their entire curriculum around principles that Arthur Feedler first scribbled in a leather notebook in 1944. John Boyd, the legendary fighter pilot and military strategist, later expanded on the same concepts. Boyd developed the OODA loop theory that revolutionized military thinking. He became famous. Books were written about him. But Boyd never met Feedler. He studied the same after-action reports. He saw the same patterns. He came to the same conclusions that a skinny kid from Dayton had reached 20 years earlier. Speed and position were more valuable than firepower. The pilot who controlled energy controlled the fight. In 1987, a researcher named Dr. Ellen Xiao found Feedler's notebook in the Air Force Historical Research Agency archives. She tracked him down and asked for an interview. He agreed. She asked why he thought his system worked when so many others failed. He said it wasn't his system. It was just physics. She asked why more pilots didn't figure it out earlier. He said because most pilots didn't think they needed it. They thought courage was enough. She asked if courage wasn't enough. He paused for a long time. Then he said courage was necessary, but it wasn't sufficient. Courage made you willing to fight. Understanding made you able to win. At Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, they named a conference room after him. The Arthur S. Feedler Flight Test Analysis Room. It's a small room with beige walls, a long table, and a whiteboard. The kind of place where engineers gather to solve problems that nobody else has figured out yet. There's a plaque on the wall. It reads, "Courage and calculation are not opposites. They are partners." That wasn't something Feedler ever said publicly, but it was something he lived every single day. From that first moment when he broke formation to save Captain Derry, to those 8 minutes alone against 8 Germans, to the years spent quietly proving that thinking mattered as much as fighting. He absorbed the mockery. He ignored the doubt. He let Captain Derry call him a coward in front of the whole squadron. He stood in front of generals and colonels who thought he was teaching pilots to run away. He never raised his voice. He never lost his temper. He just kept flying, kept calculating, kept proving that his notebook was right. And when the war was over, when the accounting was done, the numbers spoke for themselves. The pilots who flew his way came home. The pilots who didn't, many of them didn't. That was the final proof. Not kills, not medals, not glory. Just men who lived because one quiet bookworm from Ohio had the courage to think differently. The question you should be asking yourself right now is this: how many other Arthur Feedlers were there? How many quiet geniuses in every war, every conflict, every crisis, who saw solutions that nobody else could see? How many of them were laughed at, ignored, dismissed, told to shut up and follow orders? And how many lives could have been saved if someone had just listened? That's the real lesson of Arthur Feedler's story. Not that math beats instinct, not that calculation beats courage, but that the two together, courage and calculation, patience and aggression, thinking and fighting, that combination is unstoppable. The pilots who mocked the bookworm learned that lesson the hard way. Some of them learned it in time. Some of them never came home to learn anything at all. But the ones who listened, the ones who set aside their pride and picked up a pencil and learned to think before they fought, those pilots survived. They came home. They raised families. They lived to tell their stories. And every single one of them owed something to a skinny kid with wire-rimmed glasses who carried a leather notebook into the most dangerous skies on Earth and proved that math could save your life. In parts 1 and 2, we followed Arthur Feedler from a mocked bookworm to a tactical revolutionary. We watched him develop his energy management system in a leather notebook that everyone laughed at. We saw him survive 8 Focke-Wulfs alone over Berlin, using nothing but math and nerve. We witnessed his ideas spread through the 357th Fighter Group, then to 8th Air Force Headquarters, where General Kepner ordered his methods taught to every fighter pilot in the European theater. Losses dropped by 22%. Kill ratios soared from 2.5 to 1 up to 4 to 1. The system worked. But across the English Channel in the intelligence offices of the Luftwaffe German analysts were noticing something had changed. American pilots were fighting differently. And the Reich's best fighter aces were dying at unprecedented rates. The hunters were becoming the hunted. And now this was no longer an experiment. This was war. Summer 1944. The Luftwaffe High Command faced a crisis they had never anticipated. Since the beginning of the air war over Europe, German fighter pilots had held critical advantages: experience, training, tactics refined through 5 years of combat. The best German aces had hundreds of kills. Men like Erich Hartmann, Gerhard Barkhorn, and Günther Rall were legends. They had developed tactics specifically designed to counter American aggression, bait the escorts into turning fights, exploit their impatience, make them bleed energy-chasing kills they would never get, then bounce them when they were slow and vulnerable. It had worked brilliantly through 1943 and early 1944, but suddenly it stopped working. Intelligence reports from surviving pilots told a disturbing story. American fighters were no longer taking the bait. They stayed high. They refused to commit to turning engagements. They used vertical maneuvers that negated German advantages in roll rate and low-speed handling. Worse, they seemed to know exactly when to disengage. German pilots would set up perfect traps only to watch the Americans climb away before the jaws could close. In June 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 633 fighter pilots. In July, another 580. These weren't green replacements. These were experienced veterans, men with 50, 100, 200 kills. Men who were supposed to be unkillable. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, commander of the Luftwaffe fighter forces, convened an emergency meeting at his headquarters in Berlin. His best tacticians presented the evidence. American fighter losses had dropped dramatically, while German losses had skyrocketed. Something fundamental had changed. Galland demanded to know what the Americans were doing differently. His intelligence officers had captured fragments of information, rumors of a new training program, references to energy management in intercepted communications. One downed American pilot had mentioned something about comparative energy analysis before he stopped talking. Galland ordered an immediate tactical review. German pilots would have to adapt, but adaptation takes time. And time was something the Luftwaffe no longer had. Back in England, Arthur Feedler faced a different kind of crisis. His methods had been adopted across the 8th Air Force, but not everyone was using them correctly. Some pilots understood the principles, but applied them too rigidly. They became so focused on energy conservation that they missed opportunities to engage. Others went the opposite direction, using the climb and dive tactics, but abandoning the careful calculation that made them work. In late July, a disaster struck that threatened to undo everything. A flight from the 352nd Fighter Group, newly trained in energy management tactics, encountered a formation of Bf-109s over Hamburg. The flight leader, a captain who had attended one of Feedler's briefings, ordered his pilots to maintain altitude and refuse engagement. The Germans weren't attacking the bombers. They were just flying parallel, waiting. The American captain kept his flight high, watching, calculating. He refused to commit. For 20 minutes, both formations flew in parallel. Then the Germans turned for home. The American captain reported a successful mission. No losses, no damage, no engagement. But the bombers they were escorting had been attacked by a second German formation that came in low from the opposite direction. 12 B-17s were shot down. 120 men killed or captured. Because the escort fighters never engaged. The after-action review was brutal. The 352nd's commanding officer blamed energy management tactics. He said Feedler had taught his pilots to be cowards. He demanded the new methods be abandoned. Other group commanders agreed. They had lost pilots to excessive caution. The pendulum was swinging back toward aggression. Feedler was summoned to headquarters to explain. General Kepner himself presided over the meeting. Feedler stood before a room of angry colonels and explained what had gone wrong. The captain had misunderstood the principles. Energy management wasn't about avoiding engagement. It was about controlling engagement. You stayed high to maintain options, not to refuse combat. You climbed away from disadvantageous situations, but you dove to attack when the conditions were right. The captain had been so afraid of losing energy that he forgot the whole point was to use that energy to protect the bombers. Kepner listened. Then he asked what Feedler recommended. Feedler said the training needed to be more thorough. Pilots needed to understand not just the tactics, but the thinking behind them. They needed practice simulation real scenarios where they learned to recognize when to engage and when to wait. Kepner gave him 2 weeks. August 1944. The largest air battle of the European theater was about to begin. Operation Frantic, combined with the ongoing strategic bombing campaign, had pushed the Luftwaffe to desperation. German industrial production was collapsing. Oil refineries were being destroyed faster than they could be repaired. The Reich was bleeding to death from the air. Hitler ordered a maximum effort. Every available fighter would be committed to stopping the next major American raid. Intelligence suggested it would target the synthetic oil plants at Merseburg, deep in central Germany. The Luftwaffe assembled over 400 fighters. Focke-Wulf 190s, Messerschmitt 109s, even some of the new jet-powered Me-262s that were just entering service. This would be the decisive battle. If they could inflict catastrophic losses on the American bombers, perhaps the strategic bombing campaign would be forced to pause. Perhaps Germany could survive another year. The Americans sent 200 bombers escorted by 750 fighters. Among those fighters were pilots from the 357th Fighter Group, Arthur Feedler's original unit. And Feedler himself, back from headquarters, was flying with them. The date was September 11, 1944. The weather was clear. Visibility unlimited. Both sides knew this would be the fight of their lives. Feedler's flight was assigned high cover at 32,000 feet, the highest position in the escort formation. From that altitude, he could see the bomber stream stretching back toward England, a river of aluminum and contrails 30 miles long. He could see the German interceptors forming up to the east, dark specks against the morning sky. Hundreds of them, more than he had ever seen in one place. The first German wave came in at 10:47 a.m. 60 Focke-Wulfs in a massed formation attacking the lead bomber box from 12 o'clock high. American escorts dove to intercept. The sky erupted into chaos. Feedler held his position. He watched. He calculated. A second wave appeared from the south. 40 Bf-109s staying high, waiting to bounce the escorts who were now engaged with the first wave. Classic Luftwaffe tactics. But Feedler had seen this before. He keyed his radio and called out the bounce. His Flight 8 Mustangs turned into the 109s before they could dive. The Germans saw them coming and adjusted. They tried to climb to regain the advantage. Feedler pushed his throttle forward and climbed after them. His pilots followed. At 34,000 feet, the air was thin and cold. Engine performance dropped. But the Mustang's supercharged Merlin handled the altitude better than the German engines. The 109s began to struggle. Feedler reached the top of his climb with 280 miles per hour on the gauge. The Germans were still below him, still climbing, still slow. He rolled inverted and pulled through into a diving attack. His first burst caught a 109 in the engine cowling. Black smoke erupted. The German rolled over and dove, streaming coolant. Feedler didn't follow. He pulled up trading speed for altitude resetting for the next pass. His wingman, a lieutenant named Carson, followed the maneuver perfectly. Together, they climbed back above the Germans. 2 more 109s tried to engage them. Feedler and Carson worked as a team, one diving, while the other covered trading altitude and speed in a coordinated dance that the Germans couldn't match. In 4 minutes, they shot down 3 aircraft and damaged 2 others without taking a single hit. The 109 formation broke apart. Some dove for the deck, others tried to flee east. None of them reached the bombers. Across the battle space, similar engagements were playing out. American pilots who had learned energy management were outfighting German veterans who had never lost before. The Luftwaffe pilots were confused. Their tactics weren't working. The Americans weren't taking the bait. They weren't chasing. They weren't bleeding energy and turning fights. They were staying high diving to attack climbing away before the Germans could respond. By noon, the air battle was over. The results were devastating for the Luftwaffe. 120 German fighters destroyed. 63 pilots killed. 41 captured. American losses were 18 bombers and 11 fighters. The Merseburg oil plants were hit. Production dropped by 40%. A pilot from the 352nd, the same group that had been criticized for excessive caution 6 weeks earlier, described the battle in his debriefing. He said the Germans didn't know what to do. They kept setting up attacks that should have worked, but the Americans always seemed to be in the wrong place. High when they expected low. Fast when they expected slow. He said it was like the Americans could read their minds. They couldn't read minds. They could read energy states. And that made all the difference. The September 11th battle broke the back of the Luftwaffe fighter force. Not because of the numbers lost, though those were terrible, but because of who was lost. The experienced pilots. The aces. The men who had survived 5 years of combat. They were being killed at rates that couldn't be replaced. German pilot training had already been shortened due to fuel shortages. New pilots were arriving at frontline units with barely 100 hours of flight time. They were facing American pilots who now understood energy fighting better than the Germans who had invented it. The kill ratios told the story. In January 1944, before Feedler's methods spread, the 8th Air Force achieved roughly 2.5 German fighters destroyed for every American fighter lost. By September, that ratio had climbed to 5-1. By December, it exceeded 7-1. The Luftwaffe was being systematically exterminated. Adolf Galland later wrote about this period in his memoirs. He described the summer of 1944 as the death of the German fighter arm. Not from lack of aircraft. Germany was actually producing more fighters than ever. But from lack of pilots who could fly them effectively. The Americans had found a way to turn their numerical advantage into tactical dominance. Aggressive pilots had been replaced by thinking pilots, and thinking pilots were much harder to kill. News of the American success spread beyond the European theater. The Navy took notice. Pacific commanders were fighting a different war against Japanese pilots, but the principles were the same. Energy management worked against Zeros just as well as it worked against Focke-Wulfs. By early 1945, Navy fighter squadrons were being trained in the same methods. The word spread through the ranks. Fight vertical, not horizontal. Stay fast. Stay high. Make them come to you. Arthur Feedler received no public recognition for his contributions. There was no medal ceremony, no newspaper article, no photograph with generals. He was just one pilot among thousands, a second lieutenant, who never rose above that rank during the war. But the pilots who flew with him knew. The intelligence officers who compiled the statistics knew. And slowly, the institutional memory of the military absorbed his lessons into its doctrine. The leather notebook that everyone had laughed at became the foundation of a revolution. By the end of the war, American fighter pilots had achieved a kill ratio of nearly 12-1 against the Luftwaffe. Bomber losses had dropped from catastrophic to sustainable. The strategic bombing campaign succeeded in crippling German industry, shortening the war by months, perhaps years. Historians would later debate exactly how many lives were saved by that shortened timeline. The estimates ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million. And a portion of that credit, impossible to quantify but undeniably real, belonged to a skinny kid from Ohio who carried a leather notebook into combat and proved that mathematics could defeat aggression. The pilots who survived came home. They raised families. They built careers. They grew old and told their grandchildren about the war. Some of them mentioned the bookworm who changed everything. Most didn't. Memory is selective. Glory goes to the aces with 5 kills, not the tacticians who made those kills possible. But the system remained. The ideas remained. And 50 years later, when a new generation of fighter pilots trained at Top Gun, they learned principles that traced directly back to Arthur Feedler's notebook. They just didn't know his name. The war ended. The celebrations happened. The soldiers came home. But what happened to the man who started it all? What happened to Arthur Feedler after VE Day? His story was supposed to end there. A quiet return to civilian life. a degree in engineering, a career at Wright-Patterson, an obituary that mentioned nothing about 8 Focke-Wulfs or leather notebooks. But there's one more chapter to this story, a chapter about legacy, about ideas that outlived their creator, about a revolution in military thinking that most people have never heard of, and about a conference room in Ohio with a plaque on the wall that reads, "Courage and calculation are not opposites. They are partners." That story, the final chapter of Arthur Feedler's journey, is coming in part 4. From a mocked bookworm with wire-rimmed glasses to the architect of a tactical revolution. From a leather notebook that everyone laughed at to doctrines still taught in military academies today. We have followed Arthur Feedler through 4 years of war from his arrival at RAF Leiston in early 1944 to the final destruction of the Luftwaffe fighter arm. We watched him survive 8 Focke-Wulfs alone over Berlin. We saw his ideas spread from one squadron to the entire 8th Air Force. We witnessed kill ratios soar from 2.5 to 1 to nearly 12 to 1 by war's end. His energy management principles saved thousands of lives and helped shorten the deadliest conflict in human history. But what happened to the man behind it all? What became of Arthur Feedler when the guns fell silent and the world tried to forget? This story has one final chapter, and it contains a twist that almost no one knows about. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. VE Day. Celebrations erupted across England, across America, across the free world. Soldiers who had spent years fighting for survival suddenly found themselves without a mission. The killing stopped. The dying stopped. And the slow, strange process of returning to normal life began. Arthur Feedler flew his last combat mission on April 19, 1945. It was an escort run to Regensburg, deep in what remained of Nazi Germany. The Luftwaffe was a ghost of itself by then. Scattered remnants. Green pilots in jets they barely knew how to fly. The engagement was brief and one-sided. Feedler's flight encountered 4 Me-262s that broke off after a single pass. No losses on either side. The war was already over in everything but name. When VE Day came, Feedler was sitting in his bunk at Leiston, reading a technical manual on jet propulsion. He heard the cheering outside. He heard the bottles opening the songs, starting the release of 4 years of tension exploding into celebration. He closed his book, walked outside, and watched his squadron mates embrace and weep and laugh. Someone handed him a drink. He took one sip and set it down. A pilot named Henderson asked him what was wrong. Feedler said nothing was wrong. Henderson asked why he wasn't celebrating. Feedler thought about it for a moment. Then he said he was thinking about all the men who weren't there to celebrate with them. Henderson nodded slowly and walked away. Feedler went back to his bunk and started packing. He shipped home in June 1945. There was no parade, no ceremony, no newspaper interviews. He was just one of millions of veterans returning to a country that had moved on without them. His parents met him at the train station in Dayton. His mother cried. His father shook his hand and said he was proud. They drove home in silence. The house near the railroad tracks looked smaller than he remembered. The 315 freight train still shook the windows every afternoon. Some things never changed. Feedler enrolled at Ohio State that fall, using the GI Bill to finally pursue the engineering degree he had dreamed about since childhood. He was 24 years old, surrounded by 18-year-old freshmen who had never heard a shot fired in anger. He didn't talk about the war. He didn't join veteran groups. He didn't attend reunions. He just studied. He graduated in 1948 with a degree in aeronautical engineering. His grades were excellent. His professors recommended him for graduate programs at MIT and Caltech. He turned them down. He had spent 4 years away from home. He wanted to stay in Ohio. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base hired him as a civilian flight test analyst. It was the perfect job for a man who loved airplanes and mathematics in equal measure. He spent his days studying performance data, analyzing test flights, writing technical reports, that nobody outside the engineering department would ever read. He met a woman named Margaret at a church social in 1950. She was a schoolteacher like his mother. They married in 1951. They had 3 children, a boy in 1952, a girl in 1954, another boy in 1957. They lived in a modest house in Fairborn, not far from the base. Feedler worked. Margaret raised the children. They attended church on Sundays. They lived quietly. He never became famous. He never sought recognition. The pilots who had served with him scattered across the country and got on with their lives. Captain Derry, the man who had called Feedler a coward in front of the whole squadron, returned to his family's ranch in Texas. He never spoke publicly about the war. Lieutenant Briggs, the first pilot to truly embrace Feedler's methods, became an airline captain for Pan Am. He flew until 1978. Major Callahan, the operations officer, who had finally given Feedler a chance to teach, retired as a colonel and wrote a memoir that mentioned energy management, but not Feedler by name. The Bookworm faded into history. But his ideas did not. The principles Arthur Feedler formalized in his leather notebook became the foundation of fighter tactics for the next 8 decades. The transition happened gradually, almost invisibly. In the years immediately after World War II, the new Air Force and Navy established formal doctrine based on lessons learned in combat. Energy management appeared in training manuals under various names: vertical tactics, energy conservation, the boom and zoom. No one called it the Feedler system. Most of the officers writing the manuals had never heard of him. They had learned the concepts from pilots who had learned from pilots who had learned from that first briefing in a Nissen hut at Leaston. The Korean War provided the first major test. American pilots flying F-86 Sabres encountered Soviet-built MiG-15s over the Yalu River. The MiG was faster in a straight line. It could climb higher. It had heavier armament. On paper, it should have dominated. But American pilots who had internalized energy management achieved a kill ratio of nearly 10-to-1. They stayed fast. They stayed high. They refused to turn with the more maneuverable MiGs. They used vertical tactics to dictate the terms of every engagement. The methods that Feedler had developed against Focke-Wulfs worked just as well against jets. Vietnam was different. American pilots had grown complacent. A generation had passed since Korea. The new pilots had learned theory, but not practice. They relied too heavily on missiles and not enough on maneuvering. Kill ratios dropped to barely 2-to-1. The Navy responded by establishing the Navy Fighter Weapons School at Miramar, California. Top Gun. The curriculum focused intensely on air combat maneuvering, on energy management, on vertical tactics, on everything Arthur Feedler had written in his notebook 30 years earlier. Kill ratios improved to 12-to-1 in the final years of the war. Top Gun became legendary. Movies were made about it. Tom Cruise became a star. But the men who developed the curriculum were drawing on concepts that dated back to 1944. They were teaching what a skinny kid from Ohio had figured out in a bunk bed between missions. Today, every fighter pilot in the Western world learns energy management as a fundamental concept. The terminology has evolved. The aircraft have changed beyond recognition. But the core principles remain identical. Speed is life. Altitude is opportunity. The pilot who controls energy controls the fight. Historians estimate that Feedler's methods directly and indirectly influenced the training of over 500,000 fighter pilots across more than 40 nations. The kill ratio improvements those methods enabled have saved an uncountable number of lives. Tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands. We will never know the exact number, but the legacy is undeniable. What can we learn from Arthur Feedler's story? There are lessons here that extend far beyond military history. Lessons about innovation, about courage, about the strange way that good ideas spread through resistant institutions. First breakthrough ideas can come from anyone. Feedler was not a general. He was not a test pilot. He was not an academy graduate or a war hero. He was a second lieutenant with wire-rim glasses and a job at a metal fabrication plant. His only qualifications were curiosity, intelligence, and the willingness to think differently. The military establishment initially rejected his ideas because they came from the wrong person. A bookworm, a theorist, someone who didn't fit the mold of what a fighter pilot was supposed to be. Second institutions resist change, even when change would save lives. The officers who dismissed Feedler's notebook weren't stupid. They weren't evil. They were experienced professionals who believed they understood their craft. They had survived combat. They had seen what worked. And they couldn't accept that a 23-year-old with no kills could teach them anything. This pattern repeats throughout history. Ignaz Semmelweis discovered that hand-washing could prevent childbed fever in 1847. The medical establishment rejected him. He died in an asylum, while thousands of women continued dying from preventable infections. Billy Mitchell advocated for air power in the 1920s. The Army court-martialed him. 20 years later, his predictions proved devastatingly accurate at Pearl Harbor. The pattern is always the same. Someone sees a better way. The institution says no. People die. Eventually, the institution changes. But how many lives are lost in the gap between vision and acceptance? Third courage takes many forms. We celebrate the courage of pilots who charge into combat, guns blazing, risking death in pursuit of glory. But there is another kind of courage. The courage to be laughed at. The courage to persist when everyone tells you you're wrong. The courage to keep writing in a notebook when your squadron mates call you a coward. Feedler absorbed the mockery. He ignored the doubt. He stood in front of generals who thought he was teaching pilots to run away. He never raised his voice. He never lost his temper. He just kept proving that his methods worked. That quiet persistence changed the course of the war. And now the detail that almost no one knows. In 1987, a researcher named Dr. Ellen Xiao was working on a dissertation about tactical evolution in World War II fighter combat. She found Feedler's notebook in the Air Force Historical Research Agency archives in Alabama. It was sitting in a file box that hadn't been opened in decades. She read it cover to cover. Then she did something no one had done before. She tracked down Arthur Feedler and asked for an interview. He was 66 years old, retired from Wright-Patterson, living quietly in Fairborn with Margaret. He agreed to meet her. Over 3 days, she recorded 12 hours of interviews. Feedler spoke about his methods, his reasoning, his experiences. He was modest, almost to a fault. He kept insisting that he hadn't invented anything new. He had just applied physics to combat. Anyone could have done it. Dr. Xiao asked him one final question on the last day. She asked if he ever regretted not receiving public recognition for his contributions. Feedler thought about it for a long time. Then he told her about something that happened in 1952. He was working at Wright-Patterson when a young pilot came to his office. The pilot had just completed fighter training. He had heard somehow that Feedler was the man who had developed energy management tactics during the war. The pilot wanted to thank him. He said his instructor had taught him principles that came from a notebook written in England in 1944. He said those principles had saved his life during a training accident when his engine failed. He had used energy management to glide to a safe landing. He would have died otherwise. The pilot shook Feedler's hand and left. Feedler never saw him again. He never learned his name. But that handshake, that moment of connection, meant more to him than any medal or promotion ever could. Someone had lived because of something he had written in a leather notebook. That was enough. Dr. Xiao's dissertation was published in 1990. It brought Feedler's story to academic attention for the first time. But Feedler never read it. He died on March 17, 1993, at the age of 72. His obituary in the Dayton Daily News mentioned that he was a veteran, an engineer, and a father of 3. It said nothing about 8 Focke-Wulfs, nothing about leather notebooks, nothing about changing the course of aerial warfare. But at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, someone remembered. In 1995, 2 years after his death, the base dedicated a conference room in his honor. The Arthur S. Feedler Flight Test Analysis Room. It's a small room. Beige walls, a long table, a whiteboard covered with equations. The kind of place where engineers gather to solve problems that nobody else has figured out yet. There's a plaque on the wall. It reads, "Courage and calculation are not opposites. They are partners." Those weren't Feedler's words. He never said anything that quotable. But the sentiment captures everything he stood for. The belief that thinking and fighting could coexist. That mathematics and bravery were not enemies, but allies. That the best warriors were not the most aggressive, but the most intelligent. From a machinist's son in Dayton, Ohio, to the father of modern air combat tactics. From a notebook that everyone laughed at to principles taught in every fighter school in the Western world. Arthur Feedler proved that one quiet person with one good idea can change history. He never fired a shot that made the newspapers. He never led a charge that inspired paintings. He just thought clearly, flew carefully, and taught others to do the same. And because of that, pilots came home. Fathers returned to their children. Sons grew up to have sons of their own. The ripples of his ideas spread across decades, across continents, across generations of warriors who never knew his name. That's the power of thinking differently. That's the legacy of the Bookworm, who outflew 8 Focke-Wulfs with nothing but math. If you know similar stories of overlooked innovators who changed military history, share them in the comments. This is just one of hundreds of forgotten revolutions from World War II. Men and women who saw solutions that nobody else could see, who persisted despite mockery, who saved lives through sheer stubborn intelligence. Their stories deserve to be told. Subscribe to discover more hidden histories that shaped our world. And remember, the next time someone calls your idea crazy, the next time the experts tell you it can't be done, the next time you're tempted to give up because nobody believes in you. Remember Arthur Feedler. Remember the leather notebook. Leather. Remember 8 Focke-Wulfs filling the mirrors, and a young pilot who didn't pray, didn't panic, just calculated. Because sometimes the most dangerous weapon in the world isn't a gun or a bomb or a fighter plane. Sometimes it's a pencil, a notebook, and one person brave enough to think.